Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just wait for another minute or so. I think people are still coming on to the webinar that we're hosting today through Nutrition Connections. So I'll just give it another minute. Okay, I think we'll just get ready to start the webinar right now. I'd just like to let everyone know that we will be recording the webinar today. So we'll get that started shortly. So good afternoon. My name is Lynn Roblin. I'm the Senior Policy Consultant at Nutrition Connections, which is a center within the Ontario Public Health Association. And we're very pleased today to be hosting this webinar all about why we need a universal food and nutrition program for children in Canada. And we're very pleased to have the Orel Food Institute at the University of Guelph participate in helping to sponsor this event today so that you could all attend. So before I get started, oops, I'm not forwarding. I just thought I would give you a little background information about Nutrition Connections in case you weren't aware of our center. We were formerly called the Nutrition Resource Center, where we were funded by the Ministry of Health for almost 20 years. And during that whole time, we've been within the Ontario Public Health Association. We provide a variety of services, including nutrition services, resources, education and training events, and we also facilitate knowledge exchange and collaboration through various events and things like today, webinars like today. So we, as I said, we were formerly funded by the Ontario Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. And when all the resource centers lost their funding a few years ago, we decided to continue on. And we are very fortunate to be supported in part by the Elderly Foundation for our activities. So just as a prelude to the webinar today, I wanted just to let you all know that food literacy is a big focus for our work here at Nutrition Connections. We've been very involved over the last few years working on various reports and investigations around the state of food literacy and eating in Ontario. And these are just some examples of the work that we've been doing, a couple evidence briefs, a survey of food literacy programming in Ontario, and a document outlining the policies that impact food literacy among children and youth in Ontario. And this work has been supported by an advisory team of members whose logos you see here: Public Health Ontario, University of Waterloo, University of Guelph, Ontario Dietitians in Public Health, Ryerson University. In June of 2020, we hosted a virtual workshop called Food Literacy: Shaping the Health of Children and Youth. And the purpose of this workshop was to bring together researchers, policymakers, and practitioners to determine what are the key priorities regarding food literacy here in Ontario and beyond. And emerging as the top food literacy priority, of course, was school food literacy, including food literacy that needed to be part of a mandatory part of the curriculum in schools. And various supports were required, such as funding for resources and programming, equitable programming so that all children had access. How are we measuring food literacy in these environments and in these school programs? And how do we evaluate other interventions as well? Including food literacy as part of a national school food program is something that also emerged as a key priority, and that's really what the focus of today's webinar is going to be about. So today we're here to hear about a few things. First of all, we want to understand why we need a comprehensive national universal school food and nutrition program and what that would look like. So we're going to hear about some of the key recommendations and some of the advocacy efforts around that. We're also going to hear today from our speakers about the current school food and nutrition programs that exist, some of the challenges and barriers that existed before and after COVID. So hopefully we'll learn lots from those experiences as they are occurring in real time right now. So just a brief introduction of our speakers for today. So Dr. Jess Haines is from the University of Guelph, where she's also leading the Guelph Family Health Study, looking at food and nutrition of families with children. She worked with Amberly Roots on the document that she'll be highlighting some of the key recommendations around what does an integrated comprehensive food and nutrition program look like here in Canada. Amberly is a PhD candidate also at the University of Guelph, and she's also an Arel Scholar. She's done extensive work investigating school food programs, and she was involved in a survey with Mary McKenna that they're going to talk about today. And Dr. Mary McKenna is from the University of New Brunswick, and she has been very involved for a long time looking at how to promote healthy eating in schools through applied research, policies, and programs. And she most recently has also been looking at how to help schools provide food during COVID. And she'll be talking about the survey with Amberly. And finally, we have Dr. Rachel Engler-Stringer, who comes from the University of Saskatchewan, and she's done extensive research on the food environment and school food. She convenes the school food working group of the Canadian Association for Food Studies, and she's currently funded, I believe, with a CIHR grant to look at how to integrate the curriculum as part of a universal school lunch program. So we're going to welcome those speakers now, and just before they get started, just wanted to remind people that they could use their chat box or the Q&A box to put in their questions, and we'll try to deal with those at the end of the presentations. So over to Jess to begin her presentation.
Thanks so much, Lynn. And thanks so much to Nutrition Connections and the Arel Food Institute for sponsoring this really important conversation today. So I completed my PhD in the US, and while there, met and married a lovely and progressive American. In 2010, we moved back to Canada with our 2 children. And as we were getting ready to send my oldest to school, my wife was shocked, my American wife was shocked to find out that Canada did not have a school food program. And at the time she said to me, "You need to fix this." And I sort of had a laugh and thought, yeah, as soon as I figure out world peace, I will figure out how to create a national school food program. But thanks to the incredible work of the leaders you will hear from today, as well as the advocacy work by the Coalition for Healthy School Food, among others, there is a strong momentum around making a national school food program a reality here in Canada. In late 2018, Amberly Roots and I served as the scientific advisors for a spotlight report on school food and nutrition. This was sponsored by the Arel Food Institute. To create the report, we brought together researchers from across the University of Guelph campus, and this included researchers from business, economics, geography, agriculture, and nutrition. We also engaged community leaders working in school food. This included Debbie Field from the Coalition for Healthy School Food, as well as school and public health leaders. Today, I'm going to provide an overview of some of the key recommendations that we made in this report. We started the report with a rationale for why we need to focus on schools. And schools really provide the most effective way to engage and feed children and youth in Canada. Schools have the opportunity to be an environment where nutritious food choices are the easy food choices. Schools are also the place where we can support food literacy among a captive audience of youth. My colleague, Claire Tegault-Leffler's research on exploring Canadian children and youth's dietary intake at school highlights that schools are really an effective place to make change. But she also showed that there's substantial room for improving the quality of children's diets at school. In the report, we also highlight some of the benefits that are associated with a national school food and nutrition program. I acknowledge that many of you are probably quite familiar about these benefits, but I list them here to really highlight the breadth of benefits associated with a national school food and nutrition program. They span from health to being able to help redress some of the gender inequities around food work that happen in homes, to the economic development through jobs and growth in the school food service, as well as the agri-food industry. This breadth of benefits is important because it allows us to have sort of strong advocacy across numerous government ministries. By highlighting this range of benefits, we can really help policymakers to see that this is really a win-win-win proposition. In our report, we also talk about what should a national school food and nutrition program look like. So some key aspects of that are that it's universally available to all students. And this makes sure that all kids have access to the nutritious food available and the programming, but also addresses any concerns around stigma related to a school food program. The program should promote and offer nutritious foods. This is an opportunity for students to establish enjoyment, food habits related to nutritious foods early in life. We also recommend that programs should engage local stakeholders to ensure that the program is culturally appropriate and can be locally adapted. Relatedly, making sure that the program can take advantage of some of the local resources that exist. As we know, there's a number of really cool programs and relationships that are happening across, sort of organically happening across our nation. And we want to build on those and work hard to also support our local food producers. A national school food and nutrition program is just that. It's not just a food program, but a food and nutrition program that should also address food literacy, give kids the opportunity to enhance their food literacy skills, their understanding of food system, as well as nutrition and food skills through experiential learning. And the other thing is to ensure that the program has regular monitoring and evaluation so that we can learn from sort of some of the things that we do right in creating such a program, as well as sort of build on it and improve and see sort of where should resources be put, where are more resources needed. And that can happen through that sort of regular monitoring and evaluation. Now, this is where the hard stuff comes in, which is what do we need to make this happen? One of the things for sure is that it's to create a comprehensive program like this, we're going to need intergovernmental collaboration. And in the report, we talk about the importance of creating a cross-ministry working group that can move that forward. So at the federal level, thinking about folks involved in ministries of agriculture, economic development, and at the provincial level, thinking about health, social services, and education, and everyone coming together to talk about how to make this happen. What are all the steps that need to happen, steps that need to be taken to make this happen? When we thought about funding, the recommendation was for a shared cost model that includes both federal, provincial, territorial, as well as municipal funding in order to sort of ensure there's adequate funding for the program. We acknowledge that in order for the program to provide the adequate food literacy training, there's going to have to be changes to the curriculum. And there's going to have to be training for the educators in order to provide such a curriculum. And then we also talked about the importance of enhancing infrastructure and human resources. As we know, many schools currently do not have adequate infrastructure in order to provide a school food program. So that is going to be critical in order to making our national school food and nutrition program happen. But then also human resources and training. So thinking about we're going to need more teachers as well as more food service providers in order to implement such a program. And then we talked about the need for harmonized standards, that in order for agri-food, for example, to be able to make school-ready food available nationally, having very clear harmonized nutrition standards and procurement guidelines, that's going to facilitate this ability to have and support this national school program. Importantly, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, is that we've had this great momentum happen due to all the great work of the leaders, again, that you'll hear from today and others. So I think we need to think about this momentum that has happened in the recent past and continue to build on this momentum to make sure that a school food and nutrition program sort of happens and becomes a reality here in Canada. So I'm going to stop sharing and pass it along to Amberly and Mary.
Hello. So it's Mary here. Thanks for this. Thanks for the introduction and the opportunity. Amberly and I are very happy to be here to talk about our recent survey. And we'd like to note that our photos are from actual programs, and this one is from New Brunswick. So you see the picture of the crazy quilt depicting the country. We chose that purposely. We knew going into this that school food programs in Canada are complicated. Funding occurs from multiple sources, multiple models, etc. And so given Jess did a great intro for us, the 2019 budget announcement about a potential for a national school food program, it was timely to gain a clearer picture of program characteristics, which we've done during the last year. And I guess I should show myself, shouldn't I? There we go. There we are. Hello, everybody. So we knew that we had to be careful in trying to define what we were going to do given the complexity. So we needed, clear boundaries. So we decided a survey of provincial and territorial government funders of free. So that means there are pay-as-you-can kind of programs out there. Those were not included. Regularly occurring school food programs in JK to 12 schools in the 2018-2019 year. They had complete data for that year. And of course it was pre-COVID. You will see, some of you may be representing charitable organizations that are not funneling money through provinces and territories, or you may be from municipalities and you're giving money. So you're not counted in this, but we also are aware of how easy it is to double count, that many individual programs get funding from multiple sources, and we wanted to try to be as clear as we can. So we need another survey, but this was a first start. So we're going to be looking at the methods and the scope, provide them and have results, and hope a discussion about this. So we used Glasgow's REAIN model. So thanks. So looking at adoption, implementation, maintenance, reach, and effectiveness. And we also looked at the grey literature, mostly from Canada, to inform the development of the survey. And as has been mentioned, the Coalition for Healthy School Food was very instrumental in giving us feedback on what we were doing and its feasibility. So as I say, we recognize that this picture is not complete, but we hadn't had this kind of information for years. It had been the 1990s since the last survey had been completed. And we felt that we needed a clearer picture, both for the planning for a national program and also for provinces and territories to see, where are you in all of this? And so it's also important to recognize the data are self-reported. So we got really great cooperation, and Amberly took the lead on all of this. We had, as you can see, 16 provincial government and territorial government respondents, And we had, we did follow-up interviews. Again, Amberly did follow-up interviews with a number of these. Quite a number of provinces and territories use a partner with non-governmental organizations. And so we also reached out to a number of them, both with surveys and follow-up. So yeah, a really great participation, except we did not have participation from Alberta. And at that time, New Brunswick did not have a provincially funded school food program. So we can see here that we say, you know, there's 13 provinces and territories. How come you have data from 17 provinces and territories? And that's because while 7 provinces and 2 territories each funded 1 program, the Northwest Territories actually funds 2 programs, and Ontario and Quebec each fund 3 programs. So looking at the results, when we set out to do the research, we were very mindful of the model that Stringer et al. From 2017 had developed, and that looks at the evolution of school food programs throughout history. The first being more of an emphasis on food security, the second more of an emphasis on health, and then thirdly, evolving more to a multi-component comprehensive type program. So we thought that it was likely that all 3 of those were coexisting in Canada, and we're right, they are, but not to the same extent. So you can see here under adoption, we looked at the mandates, the current mandates of school food programs. So food security is the primary objective, along with, followed by education and then nutrition. We also looked at all the mandates relative to all their desired outcomes. So you can see here, public health, nutrition moves up a little bit in importance, and food security and poverty alleviation a little bit down, and then education. The aspects that would really reflect a more comprehensive approach, environmental and agricultural aspects, you can see are not high on the list whatsoever. So very secondary considerations. Now I'll turn it over to Amberly.
Great, thanks so much, Mary. So the next area we sought to look at, and a much people are very curious about, was the reach of these programs, something that we've not been able to answer for a very long time. So we looked at this in terms of the number of schools with 1 or more school food programs and the number of students currently participating. So we found that across Canada, the prevalence of school food programs really varied and ranged from 11% of schools in Alberta to close to 100% of schools in Nunavut and the Northwest Territories. Next, in terms of prevalence, was Atlantic Canada. That ranged from 90 to 96% of schools offering 1 or more school food programs, and the participation rates in those provinces ranged from 32% in Nova Scotia to 52% in PEI. Ontario, with a long established program, was the next highest at 71% of schools and 40% of the student population participating, and followed by Manitoba at 37% of schools and 17% of the student population participating. At the time, British Columbia did not aggregate their data at the provincial level, so we don't have data from a very large province there. And Saskatchewan only captured part of the data in terms of the way that they track. Next, Quebec, I should note, was in a transitional year, and if you've been following the news, they received a huge investment, and even during COVID, in terms of their school food programs. So we're expecting this number to grow substantially, but presently during this year is 9%. So overall, we found that there was a minimum, given these data limitations, 33% of public schools in Canada offered 1 or more free government-funded school food programs. And this equated to a minimum of over 1 million students, or about 20% of the student population in Canada. So the next area we looked at was implementation, program implementation. We found that amongst all the provinces and territories aggregated up, that was about over $90 million was used to implement these programs. We found that across the provinces and territories, there was significant variability in the amount of funding and how it could be used. As you can see, 4 funders noted that the funds were exclusively only allowed for food and could not be used on any other aspect of the program. This was really significant when considering that one of these aspects is food literacy. Less than half of the government surveyed allowed food to be used for this purpose. Allowed funding to be used for this purpose. And then lastly, you can see the majority of funders also prioritize funding based on a socioeconomic need of some kind in their funding. We also found it was common for government funding to be transferred to NGOs. And often this required an annual application of some kind versus it being guaranteed. Unsurprising, probably to most, breakfast was the most common. And we did learn that lunch was the most common model in British Columbia. Also unsurprising is that it's heavily volunteer driven. And to give you an example, Ontario reported over 55,000 volunteers make the program possible every year, and over 6,000 volunteers in Newfoundland. The next area was maintenance. So what were the provinces and territories and their corresponding NGO partners doing to help support programs? We found that all offered some basic supports, such as nutrition guidelines and program manuals. Where there was some variance was around monitoring. 7 provinces and territories reported that there was some kind of verification process to guarantee that the programs were universal. 6 provinces and territories verified the nutritional quality of the food, and specifically 4 used some kind of grocery receipt review process. Less common were direct annual school site visits. And presently, no provinces and territories are tracking the use of local foods or any food waste reduction targets. The next area was around effectiveness. Government and NGO partners in 6 jurisdictions reported that there are inadequate levels of funding to meet the demand for existing programs, and 3 provinces reported that there are insufficient levels of funding to establish new programs. In many cases, the provinces and territories funding really covered a quarter or less of the funds required to offer these programs. For example, in Nova Scotia, they reported it was about 25% of the cost to run programs. In Ontario, it was up to a maximum of 15% of program costs that was contributed by the government, the Ontario government. Based on current participation rates, we found that this funding also really ranged. So in PEI, that was about 10 cents per student per day for breakfast. That's just the food costs. And it ranged up to $6.36 for all types of costs in Quebec. And we got a breakdown that was about $1.20 per breakfast for food costs. Now, when considering if every student in the province and territory participated, those funding rates really go down to 3 cents per student per day in Manitoba and $1.58 per student per day in the First Nations student nutrition program in Ontario. So these variable levels of provincial and territorial funding really signal to us that there is presently an inequitable access to healthy food at schools through these types of programs. And now back to Mary.
So I know we've given you a lot of, thrown a lot of information at you very quickly, and we look forward to your questions. We did want us to sort of stop and reflect for a minute that we have come a long way. You know, we're not there yet, but we have come a long way. So when you think about how in 2020 will be the first year that every province and territory will have a provincially and territorially funded program, because now New Brunswick is funding a program. And secondly, that once a program is established, it tends to continue, and support for it tends to expand and increase, which is encouraging. We are also aware, and we really appreciate the large turnout today of all of you, how many people are devoting themselves either as a volunteer or as a paid person to really trying to make things better for students in Canada. That said, when we look at Ustinger and the 3 aspects of the models, looking at these results, it would appear to us that food security is still a very large influencer in terms of the mandate, in terms of the reach, in terms of the implementation and the maintenance and the effectiveness. So something for us to certainly think about. When it comes to health, it's a little less clear how, where health fits and the extent to which the health goals identified by Ustinger are being met. Certainly it figures large in the language that is used around school food programs. But when we think about the limited funding, when we think about how funding can be used, when we think about the reach and how there's, targeting within areas, that means that all children are not being reached. When we think about, the lesser activities around food literacy and difficulties with monitoring, it's really, we weren't able to draw a conclusion that we're able to reach those health related goals. And for comprehensive, we are well aware, and you probably are too, that there are many individual programs and smaller programs that are doing amazing kind of work and very comprehensive. But you can see from what we presented here that isn't really reaching the level of the provinces and territories yet. So in terms of a national program, then what are the implications? Jess laid out some, great opportunities for us. So we're kind of at a crossroads. Do we, assuming the federal government comes in with significant financial support, is it best to use this money for more of the same and, increase our reach and reach these students that are not getting sufficient food or sufficient quality of food now, and make it sort of a laissez-faire approach? Or secondly, do we make it more that we say, okay, we need to be more explicit about the health mandate of school food programs, and at least establish some minimum national standards, so nutrition and food standards, standards around universality, education, those that Jess mentioned, monitoring, to ensure that there's a minimum level, and then after that have more local autonomy so that they can be reflect local needs. Or as many national school food programs are, but those were established as national programs, do we try to make something that is more uniform and looks quite a bit the same across the country? So Amberly is going to think about some implications related to those alternatives.
Thank you. So as Mary alluded to, one thing that's really big to think about is really the intended reach of a national school food program, and that needs to be clarified. As we found doing this research, many funders and practitioners agree that universality is important. However, this term really has a range of understandings in practice. The most common understanding that we found was really around universal access, meaning that all children in a school can participate, but it does not mean that every child currently does. Another definition in practice is universal participation, meaning that all students in a school actually participate, which is what is practiced in Sweden and Finland. Presently, Canada's predominant approach to universality that we found could be described as what we're calling nested universality. As suggested by our reach and implementation data, schools in lower socioeconomic areas are targeted to receive funding or prioritized to receive larger portions of funding, and all students in those schools can participate if they wish. As nutrition intakes of all Canadian students need improvement, a universal participation model would serve the greatest number of students, all students, and yield the most comprehensive outcomes to support a range of Canadian sectors, as Jess alluded to, like our local agri-food sector. So in order to achieve this, really what we need to be looking at is quite a bit of increased investment from governments at all levels. While it's important to keep in mind that these programs are currently cost shared with NGOs and communities, data that was not captured in this research, school food programs having a minimum threshold of financial support would really ensure effective program operation, monitoring, and evaluation. To give an idea, in the US, their education budget is 3% is dedicated towards their school food programs. So if Canada was to match this level of investment, that would be about $1.75 billion per year. So something to maybe think about. In terms of monitoring, this was something that we found a range of practices across the country, different definitions. So there's really going to be a need to standardize program level data collection going forward. So for example, Ontario's actually 2018 program guidelines could provide a really helpful starting place as they outline some very specific definitions and data collection methods. So something to think about when moving forward and developing some nationally harmonized definitions and metrics. In the future, we need to investigate much further, obviously, than what we presented today. But we hope that this is really a baseline of some comparable data to give us an idea of where we're at and where we can be going. But in the future, investigating other types of school food programs and the sources of funding, both in kind and financial, from all levels and practitioners, would really help gain a more complete picture of school food programs in Canada. In closing, we hope that the data presented here today is an opportunity for provinces and territories to assess their current operation of programs and think about informing the creation of a national school food program in Canada. So thanks so much for listening today.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Rachel Engler-Stringer here. I'm hoping you can hear me. I'm coming to you from Saskatoon, which is on Treaty 6 territory and is the homeland of the Métis. So I am going to shift gears just a little bit, but just to tell you a bit about some research that we've been doing since March, well, actually really started in May, with school closures due to the pandemic. We can't seem to have any kind of webinar these days without touching on the pandemic in some way because it impacts us in so many different ways. So when schools were closed in March, there was an enormous amount of effort by the organizations, by school boards, schools, and community organizations and more that were supporting school food programs to figure out how they were going to provide food and supports for families as schools were shut down. And the reason why, one of the main reasons why we wanted to do this was because we had a feeling, and we were hearing anecdotally, that there was something, that there were some interesting models being created that we might be able to piggyback on and learn from as we move forward towards establishing a national school food program. So I'm just going to highlight just a few results from this survey. This data analysis has been done by my PhD student, Suvadra Gupta, and it's not complete at this point. We're kind of in the preliminary stages. In fact, she was crunching the numbers just last week, getting them ready for us for today. So I will tell you a little bit about what we've learned so far. So in terms of our responses, we managed to get 136 different organizations of various levels, various sorts to respond to our survey. We did a pretty good job of getting fairly wide coverage across the country. You see we've collapsed a few, we collapsed Nova Scotia, PEI, and New Brunswick together just because we got low responses from a couple of those provinces. And you can see that not all the territories are represented either. And finally, that two were Canadian-wide, so national organizations, so kind of didn't fit within these provincial numbers. And one of the steps we will undertake is to do some analysis by province as we move forward. That might take us a little bit of time, but we are hoping to be able to provide some province and territory or maybe aggregated data back, so that because they have had a lot of demand for this information. So here's a few things I can tell you. First and foremost, the predominant offering was food boxes of some sort. Some continued to provide meals, but the vast majority, as at least one of their offerings, provided food boxes. And so, and that those look different in different cases, but most frequently were vegetable and fruit with perhaps whole grains or a few other things kinds of boxes. And I think that was for a number of reasons. First, realizing that when kids are home with their families, providing just the children with lunches didn't really make sense when the rest of the household may or may not be struggling to feed themselves. And that could be in part for financial reasons, but also because of wanting to stay home and needing to be out and about less because of the pandemic. So on the left-hand side of this slide, you can also see that a very large majority had previously offered a program, but there was a small minority that hadn't offered a program previously, and we're actually creating new programs. But I would say overall, there's a lot of variation. There's quite a few responses. Quite a few organizations provided multiple different programs. So this is really difficult to interpret, and I still haven't quite figured out how to interpret it. But what we found was the range of numbers of food offerings was so incredibly wide that we're going to have to figure out how to appropriately report on this. You can see from this table that I've provided to you that these numbers seem really high, and that's because they are skewed due to some programs offering thousands of meals worth or snacks worth, or depending on what the offering was. And then there's a large other category as well of a whole bunch of other things that were offered that maybe on a case-by-case kind of basis. So just really what I want you to understand from this slide is how varying, but also how many people were provided some sort of food by these programs during the pandemic school closures. Foods were sourced from quite a few different sources. And not surprisingly, almost all programs used grocery stores or food distributors to some degree. But in addition, and most commonly this was in addition, they use a number of other sources. And I think the point on this slide that to pay attention to is 22% did source directly from farmers for some of their food. And I think this is important given what Jess spoke about, and given what Mary and Amberly spoke about in terms of the future of school food, and integrating more with other social, and economic and environmental benefits potentially for these programs. In terms of eligibility for these programs, again, there's a fair bit of variation. Self-referral, sometimes referral by school staff, sometimes referral by food organizations. In some cases, it was only people who had previously participated, but in quite a few cases, it was they did not have to have previously participated. And in most cases, it was both the children and their families. And that's a reflection of what I had shown in the previous slide around food boxes being the predominant offering. Again, a very wide range of people providing this food to families. And I think the one that I find most interesting, because it's maybe a little bit surprising, is 10% were professional chefs or cooks. I have heard of examples of programs where out of work food service industry people were hired on to prepare and provide food. So this is interesting. Again, I think largely because I think that there's a role for professional food service people to play in the future of school food, a really important role in what's coming in terms of a national school food program. The funding sources were, again, very varying, lots going on. Lots of different sources of funding, and I think this is actually consistent with the data that Mary and Amberly just presented. So really quite a wide range of funders. And that's kind of it. I wanted to make this short and sweet so that would be time for questions. But really, you know, the conclusion that I would come to from what we've learned so far, we're not done analyzing the data by any stretch. We've still got quite a few questions to analyze and some more thorough analysis to do. But the most important thing I think to conclude from this is how much variation in terms of programs, how much variation there was, and I think this is a reflection of the diversity of our country to a degree, but also of you know, the creativity of those in the school food sector. I think I'll leave it at that so that we have time for questions for all of the presenters. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all of our speakers. I think you've all touched on all the important parts of this comprehensive school food and nutrition program we need to understand, from sort of the recommendations of how it could work across the country and some of the challenges in making that work. And I do have some preliminary questions that you could I hope, yeah, I think you can hear me there. Just really around whose responsibility is it? Like, we've talked about different funders, you know, across the provinces or even locally or municipally. Certainly with COVID, we saw the federal government put in some money to food organizations. We saw our provincial government support programs and provide more money to snack and meal programs. And then we have the whole you know, Indigenous communities and different communities that would be reached in different ways. So I know, Jess, you spoke about it's a collaborative approach. The funding obviously is going to be a collaborative approach. So what is the best way to tackle this? Because it crosses so many jurisdictions and there's so many challenges just even with what the program looks like and how it could be funded. I don't know if anyone wants to tackle that. It's more of a Mother Earth statement because it's reality. It's a challenge, right?
I guess I'd say all of the above. You know, what we don't want to have happen is that somebody says, oh, we're going to have a national school food program. Now we've been involved, but now we can back away from it. So we you know, it has been a unique trajectory in Canada in terms of how we've evolved. There's been a lot of community building that has occurred around school food, and you know, I'm part of the survey that we did with Rachel, and to see the results from the, you know, direct from farmers. I mean, this is exciting. This is an exciting opportunity, but I'll say first, with the COVID-19, as you say, the federal government did step up and delivered funding through numerous organizations specific to food. So let's hope that they you know, that has helped them understand that this barrier that was presented for so long, that, you know, this is provincial territorial jurisdiction and it's not our responsibility, we don't want to get involved, that barrier has now been broken, and that they will significant, you know, step up and provide significant funds. You know, Amberly said $1.75 billion. I love how it just kind of rolled off her tongue, but I mean, that's a pretty significant amount of money to actually get a full-blown program.
Yeah, and I think when the government first announced that they would work with provinces on a school food and nutrition program, they actually never earmarked any funding for that. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, it's really good to see that they came through, you know, with some funding through that COVID funding. Okay, well, let's move on. There's quite a few questions that I'm going to just back up to the Q&A to the beginning. And I think some of these are related to some of the comments that Jess, you presented. So I think one question was around how do we integrate information about agriculture and, you know, some of those decisions that impact food security and sovereignty. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, and I think that question was thinking about the education for students around food literacy. And yes, I think in addition to, often when we say food literacy, it can get defined kind of narrowly as food and food skills, but in fact, in the groups that we talked about, we did talk about the importance of knowing about food systems and understanding where food comes from and what the food supply chain looks like in Canada and those sort of things. So yes, the idea was to make it that the ideal curriculum would be broad and include that, yes.
Great. And I think a lot of the presentations were talking about elementary students. So there was a question around the post-secondary students, some of the food insecurity initiatives, and wonder how people stand on that. So I'm not sure who wants to answer that question.
Oh, I've done research in that area, so maybe I can try to answer it by saying I think it's a whole other ball of wax. I think we're talking about a very, I mean, even the differences between elementary schools and secondary schools are pretty significant. And I know that the research that I do is primarily focused on elementary schools for a few reasons, because most school food programs are focused in the earlier years. So, the grades up to about grade 8, grade 9, depending on the province, sometimes lower than that. But also because the schools themselves look quite different when we're talking about elementary schools versus secondary schools. So elementary schools tend to have less infrastructure available for school food preparation, and whereas secondary schools, in part because they've had cafeterias historically and home economics and all those things, tend to have more available infrastructure. And so we actually can't even compare elementary schools to secondary schools. I don't think we have to have kind of slightly different conversations about those. But in terms of post-secondary, I mean, I think there is starting to be data, a significant amount of data showing that post-secondary schools, post-secondary students are food insecure. But I think I actually want to shift that. A national school food program is not about dealing with food insecurity. I think it's primarily about dealing with the issue of poor childhood nutrition in this country. And I think as long as we focus on food insecurity, I don't think we'll ever get to a national school food program. I think we need to shift to talking about the universal problem, which Jess pointed to in Claire Tagolafleur's research, the universal problem being poor nutrition in childhood during the school day of Canadian children across the socioeconomic spectrum. And that needs a universal solution. It's a universal problem, it requires a universal solution. And this is focused, a national school food program must be focused on nutrition and food literacy and all those things, because those go together. But I think food insecurity is secondary, and maybe there will be benefits to food insecurity. We don't really know that yet, but I don't think that can be our focus.
Mm-hmm. And that certainly answers a question that many people asked, is that program intended to be a way to deal with food insecurity? And I really like the way you framed it. We already have issues around children not following a healthy diet. And I think, Amber, maybe you want to weigh in on this, because you had talked about the program, who should it be targeted to, and what would the goal of that program be?
Yeah, I would just build off what Rachel said in terms of, just really need to clarify what universality means and what that looks like in practice. Because I think a lot of government funders refer to universality as being a value, but then there's also been these challenges around limitations of funding. So if universality is the goal, but it's only 10 cents a student, is that really universal? Can every student actually show up to the program? Would there be enough funding to actually provide meals to every student that desires to participate? And then, as I mentioned, if comprehensive benefits like economic development benefits are the goal, universal participation, so every student in Canada participating has a more opportunity to have those impacts and the universal health impacts.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for articulating that. So we had a couple of questions or more comments around how would we look at the environmental impacts of the food decisions being made for the food served in school, for example. I know we've talked about local foods that could be supportive of our local food system. So Jess, I'm not sure if you talked about the environmental impacts or, related to the food procurement guidelines in your document, or Amberly, I'm not sure who wants to answer that.
I would say it's an important goal for sure. And I think we need more research. I know there's a team in Boston doing some cool modeling to figure out if they locally source and thinking about sustainability, sort of what is the impact on cost, what's the impact on availability, those sort of things, and also the environmental impact. When they make those changes, what's the impact? And I think, again, when we think about all the benefits, if we could think about not only teaching kids about food sustainability, but creating sustainable programs. What could the impact be environmentally? I think having that data will help us advocate for why not only should we have a universal program, but should we make sure, what kind of standards should we have around the sustainability of the foods?
Mm-hmm. And I go back to the Brazil, model where they looked at 30% of the food should be coming from their local food system. And so that could be something that we could consider as well. Okay, Mary, yep.
I just wanted to also say we had an actual in-person conference in New Brunswick not that long ago about school food, and a government representative said, when we talk about nutrition policy, it's all about the foods that we can't serve. So it's a negative, and they said it. When we think about local food in schools, it just shifts the conversation completely in terms of so many positive aspects. And I go into schools, and I hope you have too, where children are pulling the carrots out of the garden and they're making the food for the salad bars, and the enjoyment, nutrition becomes kind of secondary to the whole conversation, because the focus is on this food that they are growing or that they have involvement with and their connections with the farmers. So Farm to Cafeteria Canada is, doing great work in this area, and has some funding that goes out to different provinces. And if we can get there, and I know perhaps I'm being a bit idealistic, but still, hey, dream big. That shifts, as I say, the whole conversation in a much more positive orientation, and it's a win-win-win-win, for everybody.
Mm-hmm. So you talked quite a bit about food literacy, Mary, and I know that when I think it was your study that looked at the actual funding models for most of these school food programs do not include any money to offer food literacy, and no training of the volunteers and whatnot. And I know, Rachel, you're actually studying that right now with your research. So just wondering, we know that it's such an incredibly important part of these programs. Is there any clear direction on how it can be offered in tandem with a school food program, like a breakfast or a lunch program?
So I'm not sure I have a really good answer to that question, other than to say that for our intervention research, so this is a study that we were supposed to already have the baseline data and be in the midst of the intervention right now, but due to COVID, we got the funding right before COVID hit. We haven't collected that baseline data yet. But that program is a universal curriculum integrated school lunch program. We did develop the curriculum ourselves from curriculum from various organizations across the country and sometimes beyond. And we've provided, we worked with teachers to develop that curriculum, make it as easy as possible to integrate into the school day and so on. And it covers sort of the gamut when it comes to nutrition, but also food systems learning. But we had to do that ourselves, and we had to create it in such a way as to make it easy for teachers and not have the teachers themselves have enormous amount of skill on that front. And that was largely because teachers don't get training in this, and it's I would say it's somewhat unfair to expect them to know how to do these things. So I see this as where there's a really good potential for collaboration between public health nutritionists and teachers, or public health nurses and so on, and teachers, and then also with the agricultural sector. And so I'm a huge proponent of what the Little Green Thumbs program through Agriculture in the Classroom, what they do. It is absolutely incredible, but they're so limited in terms of their funding. They can only offer it to a handful of classrooms in each city where they operate per year. And so there's really only so far that can get you. But if anyone has ever had a kid who's been in a Little Green Thumbs classroom, it's amazing. My daughter was, and it was, growing. They had this amazing grow stand and worm composting in their classroom, and they were growing cucumbers and tomatoes, and they were learning about, they basically all their science was through this amazing little grow. Probably took up like five square feet in the classroom. It was tiny, but they were able to do all this. And so I guess what I'm saying is that there's enormous capacity. There's so much we could do with this, but I don't think we can expect teachers to take this role on for themselves. I think it has to be more broadly figured out.
Well, that brings up another question, and I see several of our participants have asked this. The reliance on volunteers is huge for many of these programs, and if we're going to add that layer of food literacy onto those programs, and we do recognize the need for training of those volunteers, what does that look like in terms of resourcing these programs, funding them, training folks? That obviously is going to add, some significant impact, funding and resourcing needs to these programs.
No one else is going to step in. I just feel like I'm dominating the conversation here. So I think the reliance on volunteers is problematic. It says a lot about how much we value the labor of food and that incredibly important role that people play who are preparing food for all of our children. I think that's a reflection of what we value in our society. And I think, personally, I think that should not be the case. I think the people who feed our children should be paid a living wage for the work that they do. And, I think that sometimes that gets lost in this conversation. And I think it's really important that we keep bringing it back in, that, people who work in food service deserve to be paid appropriately for the work that they're doing. But I think on the other end, all of us need to recognize how important that role is. And so I'll put a little plug in for my wonderful colleagues, Jennifer Black and Seneca Elliott at UBC, who are exploring this more and more because of some research they've been doing in the New Westminster School District, a suburb of Vancouver, and just the importance that of the care work involved in preparing, but also being those nurturing adults for children when they're consuming that food. So, I think that's another piece of all this that shouldn't get lost. It does sometimes, but I think even in this has been 1 hour. The number of areas we could touch on and work on when it comes to school food, it's huge. And I think we need to bring all of these to the table, and we need to figure out how to sort of move forward while holding all of these really important pieces together.
Thank you, Rachel. Amberly, did you have a comment?
A quick comment. Yeah, when it comes to the opportunities in schools and volunteers, especially now in terms of COVID and job creation being on the mind and supporting people, there's a huge opportunity to actually have schools be a massive job creation effort in terms of preparing this food, the literacy activities, the food preparation, the food transportation. This could really bolster economic development across the country.
Great, thank you. And Mary?
And I know we were wrapping up, but I want to just put a plug in. We haven't talked, and there were questions that were asked beforehand about the politics of all of this. So this was 2019 budget. We're now, November 2020 of a minority government that included this in their budget, and the progress is slow. And so for all of you who are listening, the Coalition for Healthy School Food is really trying to advance this in terms of advocacy and thinking kind of on the ground. If you're not involved with the coalition right now, and I know I'm making this, quite overt, but, get if you're interested, get involved. The timing is good, and let's keep this moving forward. So we need to harness all our energy to keep this momentum going. So, and I thank you for your attention today.
Mary, you answered the question I was going to ask next, is how do we all get involved in advocating for a healthy school food and nutrition program? And as you can see, we all have our various requests to make and all of the various innuendos of the program. And so really, I think the Coalition for Healthy School Food has articulated that very well. I think there needs to be a little bit more agreement on what we're asking for and how much it could potentially cost, and how that could be cost shared among the governments and the various provinces and even locally. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done, but I would encourage you to follow up on Mary's suggestion to go to the Coalition for Healthy School Food website and join in. I think there's over 130 members now. I know we're members through Nutrition Connections and the Ontario Public Health Association, and really pleased to support that initiative. So Anyway, just any parting thoughts from any of the speakers? I think we're just at the top of the hour now, and so we're going to close down soon, but just anybody have any parting thoughts to share? No, we're all shaking our heads. Well, listen, thank you very, very much for coming to the webinar today and giving sharing your research, because that's really interesting data that most of us do not have access to, and it's really good to have that information available. So I think we will be sharing the slides from, not the slides actually, but just the recording for this event, and so you'll be able to go to our website later in a few weeks to get the that information. And I just wanted to share with the audience that we do have an upcoming forum that normally we would be offering right now for our fall forum. It's going to be an online event. So certainly go to our website and you can see what we're offering in terms of our fall forum. So thank you again to all our speakers and to all the participants who came on today. We really appreciate your attention. Thank you. Thanks again, guys, and we will be in touch.